joining me, Clara Mattei. She is assistant professor of economics at the New School for Social Research, author of The Capital Order, How Economists Invented Austerity and Paved the Way to Fascism. Clara, thanks so much for joining us.
Here it is. Thank you for having me. Thank you so much.
Okay, now I want to start with something that is not about the book necessarily, but I think it gives an analogy as to what the argument you're making in the book, which is you refer to yourself as a political economist. We refer to some people as political economists and then just other people as economists. But aren't all economists really political economists?
This is a great point, and it is one of the main themes of the Capital Order, is to make obvious to common people who aren't necessarily economists themselves how economics as a discipline is deeply political, and because the very lens you use to look at the world shows you a world that can be in one way or another, and thus also gives you different solutions. So economic models profoundly shape the way we see society, we understand society's problems, and especially economics has been internalized even if we are not aware of it. A lot of values, the fact, for example, that if we're poor, we are ashamed of it. If we look at someone who's rich, we think that he has deserved it. All of these social values and norms are actually spread by economic models that kind of assume certain very classist assumptions. And here is the critique in the Capital Orders to see how the mainstream economics that we are used to reading at school, learning on a textbook as something neutral and given and the only theory possible, is actually something that has enormous political implications. So yes, all economics is political economy, but some strands in economics admit their political embeddedness. Others, the mainstream, the dominant framework, prefers to pretend they're apolitical, but this is a very powerful move so as to impose a very classist view of the world upon all of us through austerity measures.
Right. It's an attempt to obscure the fact that we're making choices and that the economy does not exist like the weather. And it is not a question of, well, it's raining, we've got to wear, we got to bring an umbrella out there. It's in fact, it's raining because we set it up to rain in some fashions, or we are contending that the rain is actually happening and therefore we need an umbrella. I mean, I don't want to belabor that too much. I'm also struck, and we'll circle around to this, but your book endeavors to sort of expose the premise to austerity as a solution to a problem that, in many respects, again, is a choice. And what is amazing about the timing of your book is that it feels to me that Jay Powell, the chair of the Fed, has sort of, after 100 years, given up the ghost and admitted that his policies, and we'll circle back around to that. But let's just start, because what you do is you trace the history of the development of austerity as a policy choice, and specifically in the context of England and Italy. But before we get there, let's talk about the what you call the trinity of austerity, the three elements that, or I guess aspects of austerity, how they play out in our economics.
Yes, definitely. So you point to a very crucial point of the Capital Order, is to say that austerity is depicted as a necessity, as the only way forward, but it is actually the most political choice of all in order to build the false understanding that we live in the only way that is possible for humans to live which is in a capitalist economy, right? So austerity as the protector of capitalism. And when we talk about capitalism, we mean the socioeconomic system we're under, by which the majority of us takes as a given and as a necessity to go work for a very low wage and in precarious conditions in order to make a living. So the fact that we depend on the market for our survival, the fact that to eat, to sleep, to go to school, to get medicine, we have to go and sell our labor power in return for a very low wage. Well, this is exactly what austerity is aiming to protect. This is the reason for the title of the book, The Capital Order. Capital, meaning the wealth that our society produces, presupposes capital as the social relation by which we all accept our condition as wage workers. And this is something that, again, austerity builds as a necessity. But what the book discovers is that if we look at what was happening 100 years ago, we see something that, again, incredibly is so obvious today, which is that in moment of social upheaval, in moment in which people are saying, no, we are sick of actually our conditions, of not being able to get to the end of a month and being so precarious in our livelihoods, in moments in which people want to participate in economic decisions to make a change, a radical one, well, it is in this moment that austerity is crucial in order to defeat any alternatives to the current status quo. So what is austerity? Austerity is fundamentally a trinity of policies that work together to silence working people. And what are these policies? Well, fiscal austerity is about cutting the social part of the budget. So cutting welfare measures. So cutting benefits, unemployment benefits, housing benefits, Medicare, Medicaid, so on and so forth.
That is when we hear politicians say shared sacrifice. I mean, and really what they're talking about is shared sacrifice, but really shared amongst 95% of us type of situation.
Yeah, because the idea is that we got to cut to pay back the debt. Well, guess what happens? When you cut, you're not cutting on the military, you're cutting on the social services, and you are also cutting in order to give money to the creditors of our society, which are the 1%, these international financial elites, by the way, not even necessarily, part of Americans themselves. So that's fiscal austerity in the forms of cuts in the social budget. Then we have fiscal austerity in the form of where does the state take money from? And the idea is that fiscal austerity is about taxing the poor more than taxing the rich. And a fancy word is regressive taxation. The fact that actually, while the state decides to cut the top income brackets, cut corporate taxes, at the same time, it's increasing consumption taxes, which is what hits us all in the same way. So it's important to recognize that during Eisenhower's time, the top income bracket was 91%. And right now, we are actually at a top income bracket that is less than 37% in 2021. So that actually, at the current moment, the richest 400 families in the United States pay a lower overall tax rate than any other income group. So it's quite astonishing the amount of regressive taxation that is structural to the American economy. And there's plenty of research on this.
And we should just, I love to do, to remind people of the statistic. Every dollar over $470,000 during Eisenhower time would have been taxed 90 cents on that dollar. Over that amount, that would have been $3 million today. Every dollar over $3 million that you earned would be taxed about 90%. And, people can argue as to what the effective tax rate was. The effective tax rate was still even maybe 20% more than the highest stated tax rate today. So regardless, the level of taxation at that time was much greater, leading into what they call the great expansion or compression, I guess. But I'm sorry, continue.
And the idea there is, of course, that taxation in a progressive sense would have been about redistributing resources, from the few to the many. What austerity is all about is exactly the opposite. It's about shifting resources or extracting resources from the majority of Americans or people everywhere else in the world to the very tiny minority who benefits, right? Even we know that the corporate taxes were cut by Trump from 35% to 21%. So even corporations basically pay very little taxes. So this is fiscal austerity. Then we have monetary austerity. And monetary austerity is what, well, we've been seeing for the last 6 months at least, which is what? Huge increases, unprecedented increases in interest rates. So the fact that money is becoming dearer. What does this mean? Well, it means, A, that for the normal household, it's much more expensive to take on credit, because we know that Americans actually live on credit because wages are so low. So now it's more expensive to actually take on a mortgage or whatnot. Secondly, it means that these increases in interest rates are intentionally slowing down the economy because it's also more expensive to borrow in order to invest. So what we see right now is that the American economy is slowly slowing down, which means that unemployment is increasing. Layoffs are increasing. And this is not the outcome of bad theory that doesn't understand what it's doing. It's actually purposefully so that someone like Jerome Powell admits that in order to curtail inflation, we need to get rid of this tight labor market, meaning that we need to get rid of the fact that in the last year, actually workers have been doing pretty well in their bargaining power with their employees, because actually nominal wages have gone up and a lot of people have actually refused to go back to work, which means that there's much more labor demand than labor supply. So this was a very favorable moment for workers because, oh man, now I don't have the statistics with me here, but it's actually, now I think there's actually 2 job openings for every unemployed person. And it used to be just 10 years ago that there were 4 people competing for 1 job. So actually remember, but this is actually pretty impressive to give you a sense of how tight and robust the labor market is. So what
we're seeing this in the context of labor actions around the country and whatnot. And we should also say, and I don't want to go off too much on a tangent here, but Powell is claiming that the implication is, and because he's been explicit, we need to weaken labor. I don't know exactly what his words have been, but I'm paraphrasing, but not by much. I mean, he has literally said we need to weaken the labor market, and we should note though that the inflation that we have seen has outpaced wage growth to this point, which means that this is not his solution is a solution to something that is not necessarily the problem that he claims. I think there is like widespread understanding that on some level too, what we're seeing is inflation not as a function of overheated demand per se, but mismatched demand and supply because we had we had COVID and it screwed up our supply lines and whatnot. But he's going in there and this is not even this is about weakening labor. Period. End of story for him, which is not really the problem that we supposedly have. And your part of your argument ultimately is that this is not an irrational response. It's only irrational if you assume that they're trying to fix something that the inflation, as opposed to they're trying to fix an imbalance that they see between labor and capital.
Absolutely. So here is really where we see how timely the historical reconstruction is. It's because as it was 100 years ago, experts today, such as Powell, are being very explicit about the purpose of austerity in the form, for example, of higher interest rates. The purpose is to discipline workers into going back to their low-paid jobs. And this they say very explicitly. They're saying the labor market is too robust. someone like Larry Summers is telling us explicitly, in order for our economy to run smoothly again, we need a higher unemployment rate. We need to go even to 7% unemployment rate. Now it's too low. So clearly, when we see that inflation, and there's a lot of discussion about where inflation comes from, right? And many economists tell us that inflation is actually all due to markups on profits. So if you read someone like Robert Reich, someone like Rick Wolf, they're telling us actually inflation is due to the opposite problem. It's not too much purchasing power of the people, but it's actually too much political power in the hands of the few who actually decide on what prices to give to goods and commodities. So the thing here is that, as you pointed out very explicitly, is that there's a pretense that inflation is a technical problem that has to be resolved with the technical solution of increasing the interest rates. But really what is obvious is that inflation is an incredibly political problem. Why? Because inflation triggers discontent. People get upset. People realize that the system is not as efficient as it claims, that the market mechanism, the fact that our relations are mediated by money, which is unstable, might not be the best of possible world. Thus, the ideology of the best and only possible system is breaking down. In this moment, workers get more upset, of course, because their purchasing power goes down. Thus, we see how all the labor unrest in the United States at the moment, there's hundreds of strikes going on. There's this great labor tracker from Cornell University, Labor Action Tracker, that really shows real time how many workers are actually on the picket line today. This is due also to the fact that inflation is triggering this motion towards greater militancy. Well, this is the real problem that austerity is solving, and that economists and experts are so energetically pushing for, is we gotta go back to people to accept our class society as the only possible world without any form of complaint. And this is why we need higher unemployment, and this is exactly the purpose that this sacrifice, which is clearly not collective, of increasing the interest rate is doing.
All right, now, and I want to go back and circle back to your work, the historical aspect of this, which I think really is explicit. In fact, like, I'm not even as convinced that inflation in and of itself is the primary driver of the worker discontent in this country, right in this particular era. I think there's a whole host of other things, including like COVID just made people realize, like, hey, wait a second, why am I going out there and putting myself on the line to get a disease that has killed now over 1 million people in this country, well over 1 million people, for these wages before even inflation hit? I think there was a growing discontent and a broader discontent. And we should also say, before we go back to the history, up until, like, I don't know, 10 years ago, there was this we were to accept this as a law of nature, that the lowest amount of unemployment you could have in a functioning economy was like 6%. There was like, it was theoretically, we were told, impossible to have 3% unemployment, because if you did, the entire economy would fall apart. And of course, everybody believed this in the same way that, like, I guess at one point, everybody believed the world was flat. And then all of a sudden the ship just goes around and you see it on the horizon, and okay, now we just pretend like that never happened. And I think your argument is that austerity is a similar sort of like fiction that we have all just come to accept is a response to a economic law. But in fact, all of this stuff has been constructed. So let's go back to where you found evidence of this, at its nascent, I guess, at its birth, which was in the World War I or the post World War I era.
Yes. Definitely. Before I do that, I just wanted to mention, just to, for the sake of completeness, the third element in the austerity trinity, fiscal, monetary austerity, is also industrial austerity, which really points to the fact that you were pointing out, the fact that inflation is just a trigger to this discontent that comes from the fact that industrial austerity, in the form of constant privatization, constant attacks on organized labor, labor deregulation, so the fact that now there's precariousness all over the place. These, of course, are elements that increase our dependence on the market, but also boost the miserable conditions we're all in, which is one of the factors I think that people are, as you say, rebelling against in more organized way through strikes, but also in more spontaneous way through these anti-work movement that have really led the Great Resignation as a real phenomenon that has freaked out leading economists. Why is it freaking out? Well, again, because the claim here is that austerity is no mistake. Austerity is structural to capitalism because it is the main protector of capital as the social relation by which we accept our condition as wage workers. Now, austerity is structural, but austerity emerged, became visible in a specific historical moment. So here I go back to the history that you were asking me about. Austerity emerges after the Great War. The Great War was 1914-1918, a moment of explosive change for the market economy until that moment, that with the state basically breaching its boundaries of action, the war economy meant collectivizing production and the state becoming the main employer. I look at specifically Europe, the hub of where the Great War happened, and also at two countries that were in the West, Italy and Britain, right? Not the Eastern Europe where we had the Russian Revolution, the West. Well, in this West, the Great War was a big element to basically trigger a whole existential crisis of capitalism to levels that had not been seen until that moment. In 1919, 1920, the majority of European citizens, especially citizens in Italy and Britain, but not only, were of the idea that their economic system, as they had known it until that moment, was about to crumble. So they were seeing the abolition of the pillars of capitalism, which is private property of the means of production and wage relations, and were experimenting with a whole variety of different ways to organize production and distribution, from workers' councils, cooperatives, guilds, self-management that came also through the nationalization of, for example, coal, which was the main source of energy in Britain and in the world. The Sankey Committee was about to nationalize coal in 1919, which was supposed to be the first measure towards actually the abolition of vertical relations of production in favor of democratic management of the economy. Well, it is in this moment that I describe, the capital order describes in the first part of the book, is the variety of alternative societies that were emerging, not just in abstraction, but very concretely. And the case of L'Ordine Nuovo with Antonio Gramsci is very important for my story. And chapter 4 gets into the workers' council movement led by a completely different view of the world of Gramsci. Well, here it is that experts freak out. And
before we get to the freak out, I just want to just sort of like tease out a little bit more of, I mean, not just the responses, but this is a moment where people see the government of the various countries in the case of your book in Western Europe. When you say breaching what they had done before, can you be more explicit about that? Because they were breaking the rules of nature that they had defined up to that point. And then all of a sudden people were like, hey, wait a second. If we could do this during wartime, why can't we do it during peacetime? Will you be a little bit more explicit as to what those things were? Because we've just gone through the exact same thing. we just eliminated 40% of child poverty overnight. I mean, not overnight, but like, you know, we just did it. We had the U.S. government sending everybody $1,400 checks, or really $2,000 worth of checks over the course of 2 different checks, and sending parents $300 per kid. And there was a more explicit, I don't know why it had more resonance in 2018, 2019. But there was like, wait a second, we can do that. You know, 5 years ago, you couldn't suggest that that's what the government would do across the board for every, and we just had one of those moments where people are like, wait, we can do that. And will you be explicit as to what some of those things were, how they were breached at that time?
Definitely. So I think actually this is really important, is how chapter 1 of the Capital Order speaks to what just happened during the COVID pandemic. Because the very fact that the state stepped in and really breached what was considered possible or natural until that moment. Why? Well, even giving some crumbs to the people, because we're not talking big money, right? The big money went to the usual suspects, the big corporations, and went into basically repurchasing the shares and stuff. But still, the little money people got was sufficient to open boundaries for action through novel imagination of what is possible, right? The fact that people said, hey, if it's my right to receive some money and make a living, during COVID, why shouldn't it just be this the norm? Why couldn't society be based on the fact that everyone, basically on the decommodification of our existence through basic necessities granted as a right to all, right? So this is really important, because it's in these moments that all of the upheaval of the just refusal to go back to work are so threatening to the capital order and thus need protection. So we saw a little bit of what was way bigger during the First World War, which is why? Well, because I suspect that if, you know, the COVID has been assimilated to a war many times, but the reality was that we weren't really competing against other nations, right? It wasn't really a matter of life or death of a capitalist country. So this meant that, for example, vaccines were never nationalized. What we saw, though, during the First World War is that belligerent countries, in order to defeat one another, had to nationalize production all of the way, okay? There was no option. The ruling elite, the bureaucrats, and the private sector did not want to do it. It wasn't like they were like, hooray, now we go and nationalize everything. They had to do it. They were pressured into doing it because it was clear that the normal functioning of the market mechanism was not quick enough nor efficient enough to achieve the type of war production and war productivity needed in order to construct arms and actually go to the trenches and win against the enemy. So here it is that during the First World War, the state takes over production. And this means not only that it breaches the boundary of private property of the means of production, the fact that this unfettered realm of private property, all of a sudden, you see how that's a political choice. Private property is a political choice. The state has the power to expropriate private producers and take on, at least if not the complete ownership, at least the controlled production. And that's what it did in Britain, the cradle of laissez-faire capitalism, the cradle of liberal market imperialism, if we want, was doing something that was considered taboo until that moment. In the meantime, not only it was kind of questioning, right, kind of more than questioning, I would say, was unsettling the pillar of private property of the means of production. It was also unsettling the pillar of wage relations as something that was all about impersonal market forces, because the states in war economies took on the main role as employers. And this meant, again, that there was a repoliticization of what until that moment was considered a natural fact, which was, once more, the fact that we were selling our labor power for a price. This price was not a natural given. The state was deciding the price of labor. The state was deciding where to move labor. And this made very explicit that exploitation was a political choice. In a moment during the war in which workers had actually increased their bargaining power, why? Well, because people were sent to the trenches. So, like today, it was a moment in which there was much more demand for labor than supply of labor. So, in a moment in which wages could have gone up, what happened was that the state, both in Britain and in Italy, imposed upon the workers the necessity to go to work. And the mobility, they decided where to actually allocate labor. And this created a sense that exploitation was political. Again, it was a political choice. So let's say that the facade of capitalism as being something natural and given was eliminated because the demystification of the state interventionism made it clear to everyone that actually there's nothing obvious about our society. It's all a political choice coming out of collective decision making, and thus it can be subverted by different political choices that can actually aim at abolishing exploitation. And this is why there were so many different types of way in which people were thinking about organizing production for use rather than profit. And this now seems like, oh, she's, a nostalgic socialist. Actually, it was happening in very easy ways. Guild socialism in Britain was thriving. The building guilds were way more successful than their market competitors because people went to work more happily and were actually like participating in production, meaning that they were delivering in building houses at lower cost for the British cities. So this is just one example. There's many others of the successes of these alternatives that, though, were making everyone at the top very, very scared, of course.
And I think the evidence you found in these archives, both in Italy and in England, sort of illustrate the fear. And it wasn't so. It's really a two-part situation, right? Like the first part is the veil being lifted on what government can do. In some instances, what government did was not necessarily appreciated, but in other instances, but the point was, it was as if like we're all in this village and we just watched like some people walk through the forbidden zone and they get to where, where the fields are quicker, and they come back and they're like, yeah, no, it just turns out like, just like this part, you could walk right through there. It's just that we had called it the forbidden zone. Don't remember why we did that. And now everybody's like, well, if we can walk through the forbidden zone to get to the crops, maybe we can take the forbidden zone to get to the lake, and we can take the forbidden zone to go down to the village or whatever it is. And then the second part of that is that there were responses once the imagination was broadened as to what workers could do, how government could interact with people. These responses were scary to the capitalist order because they were effective and they were successful. And you went into the archives of the central banks in both, I think, in Italy and in England, and in other places to find primary source material that suggested austerity was a solution to the problem of people experimenting with other ways of organizing the economy that were a threat to wealthy people's money.
Definitely. So this is, for me, very important, and the capital order tries to give really a sense of the full spectrum of possibilities. 4 chapters describing the different degrees of radicality of these movements for alternative. So one main point is that what really was threatening the system was the fact that many people were trying to abolish the capitalist state as we know it today as well, right? That the claim for economic democracy, participation in economic decision, and democratic self-governance of production distribution meant potentially substituting the capitalist state that went hand in hand with the capitalist market and was in a way complicit and actually important in maintaining exploitation in favor of an understanding of a state that was not alienated against the people, was actually the outcome of these councils that were emerging from the bottom up. So this is something very important, because austerity was a reaction not just of the private capitalists, but austerity is a state-led, technocratic, global project to maintain capitalism intact. So fundamentally, what we saw is that the reaction came, and the story is told through the archives and through people, right? So I tried to make it less boring for the reader in telling a story of protagonists that went from the radical workers in the first part of the book to the economists who were advising the governments. And so what happened is that they get together at these international financial conferences of Brussels in 1920 and Genoa in 1922. And it's here that for the first time, economists are asked to advise governments and states. So it's very interesting also, because the story is also about the economists gaining the authority of the expert, the neutral, supposed neutral, unbiased actor who is supposedly giving us the solution to cure the crisis in the name of the benefit for all. So here what we see is exactly the same rhetoric that goes on today. Invocation of sacrifice, the fact that we're living beyond our means, and that everyone has to sacrifice for a better world for everyone. And of course, the underlying analysis here is to really unveil, as you put it, unmask how classist actually the austerity project was, because it was not about everyone suffering for everyone gaining, but actually the majority suffering for the few gaining. And this is exactly what happened, is that in Britain, increases in interest rate and the cuts in social spending produced an economic downturn, exactly what's happening now, by the way, right? Both in the US and in Britain and everywhere else. This production of a recession, self-induction of a recession, was very rational because it tied the hands of organized labor, and it defeated all of these alternative practices that had been, in a way, been emerging in the last couple of years. So in 1919, 1920, by the mid-20s, someone like G.D.H. Cole, who was a leader of guild socialism, had no other anything to say but, as he put it, and this is him, and again, this comes from the archive, is him saying, the big working class offensive has been successfully stalled off. And British capitalism, though threatened with economic adversity, felt itself once more safely in the saddle and well able to cope, both industrially and politically, with any attempt that might still be made from the labor side to unseat it. So here it's very clear how rational austerity is. It was successful in producing the conditions that killed the bargaining power of the working classes, because strikes, once unemployment goes up, strikes go down,
right.
Labor mobilization goes down. And here again, we are again in a moment of industrial peace, which is exactly what someone like Jerome Powell today is aspiring towards, is fundamentally the fact that all these strikes stop and people just go back to work, right? So this is what happened in Britain. But in Italy, and this is where I think a very strong message of the capital order comes in Italy, the same exact austerity code, which was again devised at these international financial conferences, was put into action in the most efficient way by Benito Mussolini, the first fascist leader, the man who was at the origins of the fascist regime that lasted 20 years. Well, the reason why Mussolini was so successful in strengthening his power, he came to power in 1922, was because of austerity. So austerity was, for him, he was very smart, Mussolini. He realized if he put into practice austerity, not only was he going to defeat the revolutionary movement in his own country, he was also going to gain a lot of consensus from the liberal international elite Anglo-American elite who couldn't wait but to have someone like Mussolini reestablish the capital order in Italy.
Okay, and so there's a lot to discuss here, but let's just start though with Brussels and Genoa. Like, how self-conscious was because I mean, the experts that were brought in, they are elevated to, like, we're scientists. We're just telling you that if you, we're as economists, as scientists, as opposed to economists as politicians or, sort of like policy prescribers. We're scientists. If you add this, you're going to get this reaction. If you take this away, you're going to get that reaction. This is the way it works. These are laws of nature, et cetera, et cetera. We're not making any choices here. We're simply responding to a natural phenomena. How were were there heterodox economists at that time? A, and B, if there were or weren't, like, because the deal is sealed with who you invite to that conference.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's the primary thing. Like, you don't need to do much. If you get the right people to come in and be the experts, then the outcome is more or less, as long as we all agree that we're in a class war, we want this class to win. You guys are the ones who are basically the palace guard of this class. If we invite you into the conference and you're the one to offer the papers and the ideas, we can decide which idea we want, but they're all going to go towards the same goal. How what was the state of the discipline of economics at that time?
Thank you. So, very important, this unilateral warfare of austerity was played by actors who were economists of the same mainstream type that we have now, because they were building the neoclassical framework, which is still the one, again, which is dominant today. But it's interesting because at the time, they were not yet orthodox as we understand it now, because the neoclassical framework was just getting diffused in the early 1920s. So interestingly is to see how austerity went hand in hand with the emergence and the spread of mainstream economics as we know it today. And at the time, part of the effort of the Economist was to gain this novel legitimacy and to basically eliminate other frameworks that, of course, were present. So even the classical political economy perspective of someone like Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, that sees the world as made up of, sees capitalism as a unique economic system made up of class conflict, in which the source of value is the worker and surplus comes from unpaid labor. Well, this framework is completely substituted at the end of the 1800s. So, and in the beginning of the 20th century, it's just really emerging with this novel framework, not of classical political economy, but, as you put it before, of pure economics. Neoclassical economics was at the time very intelligently called pure economics, exactly to expel the political element from the very title of the discipline. And instead of classes and conflict, pure economists were seeing a world made of individuals and harmony, and a world in which the word capitalism disappeared. Magically, we shouldn't be talking about capitalism anymore. We should be talking about markets, because capitalism was, in these models, completely naturalized to the point that you weren't even discussing it as a unique socioeconomic system. It was just the only system.
It was just normal. It was just the way the world works.
Absolutely.
And that's it. And the way that, and I assume that the way that the concept of pure capitalism, or pure economics, I should say, rises to the top is I would imagine at the turn of the 19th century, entering into the 20th century, the way that a academic discipline rises or falls is a function of how much monetary support it gets from wealthy people. Like there's no internet. There's no, I'm not, people aren't going out and just like, oh, this looks like a good economics book, I'm going to buy this one. It really is basically chairs that are established at universities by wealthy people. And of course, they're going to support, consciously or not, forget about intent, they're going to support the ones that have that naturalize a system that justifies their wealth, essentially.
Absolutely. And this is really, really the key, right? So first of all, that the battle was being played at the level of academia. So my protagonists are people like Maffeo Pantaleoni, one of the founders of this, also what is known as the marginalist revolution. And he was in Italy, and he was, colleague of Vilfredo Pareto, Balraj, Jevons, all names of the founding fathers of the neoclassical framework. Well, Pantaloni was fighting an academic battle because he had purchased, with the help of the Giornale degli Economisti, so the main journal, and was trying to get rid of the historicist school that in Italy, for example, was dominant until that moment. But here, the whole point is also that this academic battle had enormous political consequences, because it is this new model that justifies exactly what you pointed to, that justifies the fact that the wealthy are entitled to extract resources from the majority and keep it to themselves. How? Well, while classical political economists were pointing their finger to the worker as the engine of the economic machine, all of a sudden it is the saver investor who takes on the leading role in the economy. At that point, you can become saver investor if you're virtuous and if you're a good individual. There's no classes, everyone can make it. Those who make it at the top are because they are actually gaining in favor of everyone else. So of course, the only rational policy here is austerity, because austerity is all about shifting resources from the majority to the minority. So we see here how austerity necessitates theory to back it as a type of state-led policy, right? So this is why theory and policy go hand in hand, and they reinforce one another. And you need both in order to convince people that there's no other alternative but appropriate the majority. How? Again, privatizing, cutting social welfare, repressing wages, all in favor of increasing the profits of the few. And experts who tell you, look, we have nothing political. We are pure economists. We're using mathematical models that are absolutely beyond class bias. We are the most neutral and trustworthy. You people, you're just too ignorant to understand economics. Leave it to the expert. Now we have all internalized the idea that any economic decision should just be left to the expert because we're too dumb or we're too ignorant. So just leave it to the Fed officials. Leave it to the people leading the Treasury. Actually, this again was not something normal, was constructed in a moment in which people were demanding a greater say in decision-making processes, in which central banks were about to get nationalized so that it could actually become a matter of political choice if you were going to increase the interest rates or not. Well, it is in that moment that experts were all about, no, we need independent central banks. We need to preserve decision making because we are the only neutral, intelligent, knowledgeable parts of society. And of course, this is exactly what the system needs, is a class of experts to justify it.
And I would argue that they don't even wouldn't even call it theory as much as law. Like we're just, we have a theory as to why it rains, but it really is just like, this is just physics, and it rains, and so all right. So coming back, I mean, I think the case that austerity was a defense mechanism for capital, particularly deployed when there was some type of risk to the capitalist order because of something that is, exogenous that is happening, like in the context of COVID, sort of like forces, or war, I guess, forces the government to respond in a different way that we prior to thought was impossible or forbidden for some reason. Why? I know that we have some of that. Like we're seeing like an uptick in labor action. And I think we also, even in the wake of the financial crisis, we have seen a broadening of imagination as to how perhaps our economic system can function. But like, how does I'm reading I'm reading economists who I appreciate but there is yet to be it seems to me, a full-throated response to what Powell is doing, because that's really where we're seeing the austerity at this point. I mean, and we would have seen, the Inflation Reduction Act, which I have no problem with naming it that, if it passes, was not austerity. It was the opposite. And it should have been much bigger. But in terms of our government response, it seems like the primary driver of austerity at this moment, within the past, I guess, at least in the Biden administration, has been the Fed. Where is the full-throated response? Not that like Jay Powell doesn't seem to get it. Like, where is the full-throated response of like Jay Powell gets it? It's just that the rest of us don't get it. Like, he's not worried about inflation. He's worried about labor power and a growing discontent with the system. Raising interest rates is not going to bring those 2 million people who retired early back into the fore. It's not going to bring back the, 750,000, maybe more, 800,000 workers who we lost, to COVID. Where is the full-throated response of like, he is showing us that he's playing a different game than everybody presumes he's playing.
So I think you raised a super important point, and it's the reason why I hope the capital order that I just published gives a kind of provides some critical tool to people to see what's actually happening. Because it's the fact that these experts use such technical jargon, speak about the labor market being tight, the labor market being robust, supply and demand. It's all a way to depoliticize the issue, right? It's the best way to create a detachment from the daily lives of people who think, well, that doesn't really, regard us. It must be something that just, it's all very technical stuff. Actually, austerity is all about molding people's behavior, disciplining people's behavior. And this, the experts 100 years ago saw very clearly. And this is why the words that the capital order takes from the archives, right? The fact that all this archival research is also to show the jargon that was being deployed 100 years ago, which is exactly the same type of jargon we see now. But in that time, it was even more explicit how it was done to defeat specific classes. But today as well, I think it's more than ever obvious. But economists, even of the most progressive type, are not used to seeing what they do as political because they bought into the narrative that economists are just not political. So, to even just say, hey, listen, this is political and it's affecting specific sections of the society rather than others, is something that it's even if it's obvious to the experts were so good at imposing austerity for 100 years now that people don't even see it. So they know they're protecting capital, because this is a thing. I think the point here is to say that capitalism, even if they want to have us think that it's always going to remain alive, those in power are very worried of how socially constructed our society is and how potentially fragile it is if the majority rebels. So they are very existentially aware in a way, right? The existential angst is the driver of austerity, and the experts know it. Now, the point is, the austerity has been so successful in the last 100 years that everyone else that is being screwed over by austerity has a hard time realizing that this is all a unilateral class warfare against them.
And we should say that when you say austerity has been successful, it has been successful in squelching any type of attempt to reorganize society, but on its own terms. And I think you cite Mark Blythe, who we've had on the program. Austerity does not do what it purports to do within the context of those who deploy it. But austerity has been quite successful in disciplining labor and those who would reorganize society in a different way.
Yeah, and just increasing the scissor of inequality, right? Which means that while wages stagnate, profits go up. And this is exactly what has happened. And this is, again, the explicit result of these type of policies. And we just need to really, I think, look through them. And that's why the lens of the historian, who is able to provide a different narrative to what happened in the 1920s. Until I wrote this book, there's very little about how important, how key the early 1920s were in order to kind of set the tone for all policies to come in the 20th and 21st century. So it is the lens of the responsibility of a critical historian is to provide some form of historical evidence that can help the reader today to be like, so maybe I should get more involved. So maybe we shouldn't just gobble up whatever they tell us as the necessary economic truth. And this is, for me, really important. And that's why I spent so many years. This is a project that took 8 years to work on. And I would also like to say that it's a book dedicated to Gianfranco Mattei, who was my great uncle, who actually committed suicide in prison when he was caught by the Nazi militia who was occupying Rome. He was a partisan building bombs against the fascist occupancy of Italy. At that point, there were a lot of resistance, civilian resistance. He was caught, tortured, and in order not to speak, they were actually giving him some poison to have him speak. And he realized that he was about to kind of, give in. And that's when he decided to kill himself in jail. So the point here is that this book for me has a very clear political message, because there's many people out there who are actually fighting for alternatives, but they're usually silenced exactly because they don't have very many channels to express these possible alternatives. And this is why it makes me so happy that there are shows like yours in which you do give voices to different perspectives. And this is part, I think, of the battle and why I wrote this book, really, to get out the message that if we also, history is not a neutral activity, right? The work of the historian is also a political work, even if also historians like to portray themselves as neutral. Any social scientist, any thought is deeply political by the very fact that it is embedded in a certain system. So giving a different narrative for the past helps us construct a different perspective for the future. And this is really why I think I have a message here that I really believe in. And I put so much effort into getting it finally published.
Well, Clara Mattei, we will put a link to the Capital Order, How Economists Invented Austerity and Paved the Way to Fascism. Thank you so much for your time today. Congratulations on the book.
Thanks.
It's fascinating work, really important, particularly timely right now. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much.